Welcome to The Other Side of Medicine, a trusted source for education, not medication, for 35 years. In every episode of The Other Side of Medicine, we deliver health information your doctor won't tell you about. My guests are the nation's leading health experts in science-based natural medicine, physicians, authors, researchers, and clinicians. We believe natural medicine should be first, drugs and surgery last, and so we promise to deliver you the next generation of health information built on three principles: common sense, science, and cooperation with nature. I'm Dr. Krystosik, and tonight we are privileged to have Dr. Musto. He's a chemist. He's a very, very well-versed diagnostician. He has received his medical degree, not a medical degree, his Ph.D. From the Northeast University in Massachusetts. And he has over 50 years experience in helping to diagnose conditions in laboratories. And he also has published in 20 different medical journals, scientific journals. And so we are very pleased to welcome him this evening. Dr. Musto, welcome to The Other Side of Medicine.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Well, I know that I recently got introduced to you through Functional Medicine University, and you had just given a presentation there the other day, and I was intrigued by that. And I hadn't heard about this particular condition we'll be talking about a little bit later called Marfan's. Is it called Marfan's syndrome?
No, it's chronic inflammatory.
Chronic. Well, we were talking about chronic inflammatory response. And by the way, let's define that right now. What is chronic inflammatory response?
All right, it's a condition that affects multi-systems and multi-organs, and it's brought about by exposure to a certain population of biotoxins and neurotoxins. When we talk about water-damaged buildings, within 48 hours, they start producing mold on the walls, on the floor, in the wall themselves. And this water damage, within, as I say, 48 hours, mold and bacteria start to grow. And these organisms produce multiple toxins, biotoxins. And the biotoxins are basically molecular organic compounds, and they're relatively small. And when you inhale them, they'll go in through your lungs into your circulation. Now, these people who get deathly ill from this, there's about 24% of the population have a defect in their immune system. So their immune system does not recognize these foreign toxins, and they circulate continuously for months, for years. Patients I've spoken to on the phone, and this is classic in this field. Patients have been to 5, 10 different doctors over the period of several years, misdiagnosed because the doctors are not familiar with biotoxin illness. And chronic inflammatory response syndrome is the general category that includes this. For example, what
are some of the symptoms that these people present with to their physicians?
They present with brain fog. Some present with dementia, and they're misdiagnosed as having dementia or Alzheimer's. They have a whole host of symptoms related to dysregulation of antidiuretic hormone, osmolality, ACTH, cortisol, endorphins.
So it disrupts the hormones inside the body as well.
Absolutely. And there's a key hormone called alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, alpha MSH, which is a very key hormone that affects like a domino effect on these other hormones that I just mentioned.
Mhm.
And where Marcons comes into play here is,
Well, let's before we move on, let's talk about some of the other symptoms. You told me earlier there's over 37 symptoms that people can present with.
right,
Let's talk about some more of the symptoms. We talked about brain fog, talk about fatigue, joint pains, muscle pain. What are some of the other symptoms? I mean, can people have sinus infections? Can they have
they can have
sinus congestion?
they can have sinus infections, not from this Marcons, but just in general.
I mean, because it's inflammation. It can happen in the sinuses, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this condition produces massive inflammation through the production of cytokines. Some of the
So
other symptoms,
cytokines, just for our listening audience benefits, those are inflammatory compounds that are
yes,
produced by the body.
right, in response to these toxins that continue to circulate.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is 24% of the population have this defect in their immune system. And these
So
toxins,
genetically, they're not able to clear out these biotoxins.
exactly right. Exactly
Okay.
right. Okay. And as far as symptoms that are associated, chronic fatigue is one of the major symptoms. These people have problems with shocks because the disruption in the antidiuretic hormone, they deposit salt on their skin and they become a conduit for electrical sparks and shocks.
So if something that touches them that's got that on there, they'll get zapped by it real quick.
Those kind of things. They have urinary problems where they're frequently urinating. They're constantly thirsty. As I say, there's about 37 of these symptoms that Dr. Shoemaker took related
Now, who's
to.
Dr. Shoemaker before we go on, so people can understand who he is?
Okay, Dr. Richie Shoemaker was a primary care physician back in the 90s in a town called Pocomoke, Maryland. And he had patients coming to him. In the Pocomoke River, there were fish dying, and people who were around the fish were getting extremely sick. This is where I mentioned earlier, neurotoxins.
Mm-hmm.
So people were inhaling this and they were getting very, very ill. And he had one situation where a woman came to him. She had severe diarrhea. She had brain fog. She had muscle and joint pain and a number of other symptoms. He prescribed for her a drug that was used in the 70s and 80s to reduce cholesterol. It's called cholestyramine. It's a binder. It's an anion binding chemical or drug. Well, he gave this to this woman to stop her severe diarrhea. And she called him back 3 or 4 days later. And she said to him, all of her symptoms were gone. So it not only stopped the diarrhea, it was pulling these neurotoxins that she inhaled from being near the fish that were dying. And that got him started on biotoxins and neurotoxins. And over about 15 years, he developed and published a number of papers showing the relationship between mold and bacteria producing toxins that this 24% of the population couldn't eliminate because of the defect in their immune system. So he is I would say, probably the world expert when it comes to diagnosing and treating patients with chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
Okay, could you talk about when these people this percentage of this 22% of the population that can't clear out these biotoxins. Let's talk about the mechanisms in the liver and with the bile acids. Let's talk about what happens and how this cholesterol lowering drug is able to clear that out. So let's talk about that.
I think what happens is the binder pulls the toxins out from the bile so it doesn't recirculate. Okay. And the toxins are generally negative charged compounds. And the cholestyramine is a positively has multiple positive charges on it. So the toxins bind to this, I think, in the bile. And that's where the cholesterol, it was originally developed to reduce cholesterol by pulling the lipids out of their system, and then they would excrete it.
Yeah, so that's where the toxins store in fat.
Yeah.
And so the people with a defect, they can't clear that out of their body, so it gets recirculated into their system, right?
Exactly right. Yes.
And that's where they end up keeping these chronic symptoms that they have. Okay, so the drug, the cholesterol lowering drug, was work. So from our perspective here on the other side of medicine, there are things that work in tandem and work similarly to the cholesterol lowering drugs. And one of the best things is different types of fiber.
Yes.
And fiber will pull out, and get rid of the bile acids as well, and the toxins in there too. So people can use that as an alternative to the cholesterol lowering drug, correct?
Yes, I know that there are a number of doctors don't use cholestyramine, although Dr. Shoemaker is pretty strong about, he thinks that's the best binder. But the problem with cholestyramine is it has some uncomfortable adverse symptoms. Patient feels bloated, they get constipated, okay? And I know from speaking to some of the doctors who treat these patients, they will also prescribe a magnesium salt to minimize the constipation issue, okay? But I know that there are doctors who use 2, 3, 4 different types of binders that seem to be effective on their patients.
I mean, there's all kinds of vegetables in the plant kingdom, like beets, I know is a very good way to pull out the bile acids. That works very well. And, there's a lot of other vegetables that are high in fibers. And I know the fiber, psyllium seed and inulin and these other fibers are very effective in pulling out those bile acids as well. And they're well researched, by the way, too.
Sure. Yep.
Okay, so then let's talk about does this lead into you mentioned Marfan's condition here. Let's talk about that for a minute, okay? Let's dive into that.
All right. Well, Marfan's is an acronym for multiple antibiotic resistant coag negative staph. Now, this came about, I think it was around 1998. There were some publications that came out of Australia. And these doctors identified coag negative staph that were multi-resistant as producing 3 different toxins. 2 of them are called exotoxin A and exotoxin B. And the third is hemolysin. Now, the exotoxin A and B, here's where that very important hormone, alpha MSH, comes into play.
That's the one you mentioned earlier that has a cascading effect to trigger other hormone responses that are negative.
Exactly right.
They're negative, yeah.
These exotoxins produced by the Marfan's was first shown in this Australian publications. Actually, the publication appeared in the American Journal of Medical Microbiology back in around 1998. I think they were the first to identify these toxins that were being produced by these bacteria. So patients who have chronic inflammatory response syndrome are going to have a low MSH hormone level. MSH, in addition to that cascade I mentioned earlier, has a protective activity in the nasal passage, in the nasal membranes, to prevent marcons from colonizing. Now, there's publications.
Now, let's just stop here for a minute. I don't want to lose our audience. Okay, we're talking about marcons, which is a particular staph bacteria.
Right? Negative staph. Yep.
It's a staph bacteria that can congregate up in the nasal passages, right?
Exactly.
Okay, yes. So let's just make sure we got everybody on the same page. Let's move on. Okay.
So these patients, I'm going to call chronic inflammatory response syndrome CIRS, CIRS. Okay. So I don't have to say chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
That's right. So CIRS, that's the chronic inflammatory response. We're going to call that CIRS. People with CIRS, go ahead.
They're going to have low MSH. It's complicated by the fact that they're also going to have marcons. And the marcons, toxins that I mentioned, the endotoxins A and B, cause further breakdown, degradation of MSH hormone. And
so it's very important. It's very important. Again, I apologize for interrupting you, but I don't want to lose our audience.
Yes, absolutely right.
The bacteria that congregates up in the sinuses, the staph bacteria, then it has a cascading effect that it decreases this very important hormone, MSH, and it decreases the levels of that, which complicates it even more.
Yeah, the marcons producing these toxins break it down even further. Now, I've spoken to a number of different clinicians, either on the phone or at a national meeting over the last several years, and they tell me that the patient never completely recovers unless they eradicate the marcons. There's no drug to bring the MSH up, but I'm told by the clinicians that if they're treated with the cholestyramine for like a 3-month period, and they're treated to eradicate the marcons, the MSH could go from a very low level of, say, 10 picograms per ml up to 25 or so. The cutoff is 35, the lower limit. But when they get up into the 20s, close to 30, a lot of the symptoms subside because now the MSH is coming back to normal. And one of the things it does is it prevents a lot of inflammatory cytokine production, which is a big part of the symptoms that are generated in this. So that's where, and I mentioned the marcons produce hemolysin. Hemolysin affects the red blood cells.
And again, hemolysin is a toxin, one of the 3 toxins that the staph bacteria in the nasal passages produces, these 3 different toxins, and this one is one of them. Go ahead.
Right. And the hemolysin affects the red cells. It also affects the endothelium membranes. And this leads to...
So just let people know the endothelium is the lining of the blood vessels and the lining of the gut.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Exactly. And this leads to coagulation risk. And it also leads to the production of antiphospholipid antibodies. And
so can people end up with strokes because of this?
Oh, yeah, because they produce clots. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, just for our listening audience, I want to just go slow here.
Okay. All right.
We could end up having clotting, and we could have strokes, and doctors don't even know the cause. Okay, go ahead.
So these are some of the reasons why MARCoNS are so important. Now, I keep mentioning the
Now,
term.
you mentioned just if I may interrupt, you mentioned
Sure.
earlier that this staph that develops in the nasal passages is antibiotic resistant.
Yeah, we run 15 different antibiotics, and there are, in those 15, there are 13 different classes. And Dr. Shoemaker, from a study he did in 2003, and it was peer reviewed and presented at the American Society of Microbiology, he showed that the production of resistance in the coag negative bacteria had a direct effect on the success of the cholestyramine treatments. And he found that we all know about MRSA. Well, we see quite often with these coag negative staph, we see methicillin resistance plus other resistances. And he found in this study in 2003 that when the MARCoNS show multiple resistance, including methicillin resistance, they're even more difficult to eradicate. Okay, they're even more resistant. And again, that it's so important to eradicate them because of the effect it has on MSH.
Mm-hmm.
And the MARCoNS also have their own symptoms. For example, patients who are positive for MARCoNS will complain of brain fog and other cognitive issues. And again, I mentioned it's not considered an infection, it's a colonization. Now, I mentioned that the MSH hormone is suppressed, and that's why a patient will get the MARCoNS. Well, the MSH hormone, turns out, has antibacterial activity. So if it's up at a normal range, it's saturating the tissue in the nasal passage, and it prevents the MARCoNS from getting established.
Okay, do people with MARCoNS end up with sinus inflammation in their sinuses?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Really, that's kind of it. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if you're seeing that they're actually colonizing in the nasal passages and they're not triggering any symptoms there, but they're triggering symptoms throughout the body.
Yes.
And affecting everything through the circulation, that's their camp, but they're not affecting it necessarily, but it can, right? It can cause sinus problems.
Yeah, I would say patients who have a compromised immune system, any bacteria in a patient with compromised immune system could cause infection.
Well, let me ask you this. Does either MARCoNS or does the I would think chronic inflammatory response syndrome would affect and would weaken your immune system.
Oh, it does.
So then this, in my estimation, would make a person more susceptible to all different kinds of infections, including sinus infections.
I agree with that. Just an aside, we're all familiar with MRSA.
Right.
Methicillin.
By the way, my dad died from MRSA. I think I told you off the air. My dad died from it, and there wasn't any antibiotic that could touch it. And by the way, just a little side note on that. I really like to interject these things.
Sure.
My wife had a MRSA infection on her leg, and I treated it with herbs initially. We didn't know it was MRSA initially. Okay, I just knew it was a bad infection, and so I treated her at home with herbs, and it got about 95, I'd say 98% better. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to go back to work. I said, you can't go back to work, but she did. And then when she went back to work, I said, you got to be taking these herbs throughout the day at work. Well, she came home that night and she did not take the herbs. Okay. I said, did you take them? She goes, no, I didn't have time. I was too busy. She's an EFTA. She does fillings in a dental office. She's a,
Oh,
she does the fillings. Doctor drills the holes, gets rid of the cavities. She puts the fillings in. Well, anyway, she had no time, she said. So she came home and I saw the leg was all inflamed again. I said, we're going to the hospital. You're not listening. So we did. We went to the emergency. They gave her some antibiotics. They did a culture. 3 days later, we went back. It was getting worse. They said, yep, she has MRSA. And so they gave her another course of antibiotics. Nothing touched it. We went back again. They gave her interjection, IV, and another antibiotic. Nothing touched it. I said, you're staying home. You're not going to work. I
wow.
nursed it for a week and it got rid of it. And all those antibiotics, Dr.
Yeah.
Musto, did not touch it. Just a side note, but the herbs did.
Yeah. Yeah. I can believe that. I've done some testing with oregano and a couple of other herbs.
Yeah,
And
that's
they
one
sure
that I
got,
used, but there was multiple other herbs that I used.
yeah. Just a comment
I'm
about
sorry. I'm
that.
sorry for sidetracking you over there.
No,
Okay,
no,
but
no,
you're talking about MRSA.
no, that's okay. I just want to add one other thing to what you just said. Uh, I've done a number of experiments at the lab over the last 6, 7 years with, I'm going to call it colloidal silver, but that's really a misnomer. It's ionic silver.
Okay.
Okay, silver with a +1 charge. It's very active. It kills everything.
Okay.
Gram positive, gram negative, mold, and yeast. And there's this one company, and I have no affiliation with any of these companies, but this one company's product I've used over the years. And they use silver in a gel for like wounds. And I would see possibly in that situation, actually painting that on to the wound would kill the organisms.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it kills MRSA, it kills Staph aureus, it kills beta strep, kills everything.
What's the name of that company? What's the name of that company?
Results are
RE results. Okay, good.
no results RNA.
Oh, results RNA. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that for our listening audience to benefit. You know, I got to tell you, Dr. Musto, I have not been a real advocate of colloidal or ionic silver, as you put it. I have not been an advocate because I've never found a company that I felt got very good results. So I'm anxious to try this company. I really am.
I can send you some studies that I've produced over the last 6, 7 years if you're interested.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That really is exciting. And like you said, you have no affiliation. You just had
No,
curiosity.
yeah, and as a result of a study I did 4 or 5 years ago, I I was friendly with a compounding pharmacy in Massachusetts, and he would have me do some studies on new products to treat this mark-ons. And as a result of me doing these silver experiments on my own, and I gave him the results, he developed a nasal spray.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
I'll have to get that from you. I'll have to get that from you off the air too. I'd love to get that for my patients. Wonderful. Thank you.
Getting back to mark-ons in the nose,
Yes. And
in the
MRSA.
laboratory, we do quite a lot of nasal cultures. We see so much Staph aureus in these nasal cultures. Staph aureus is a pathogenic organism on the one hand, but about 25 to 30% of the population carry this in their nasal passage. Most of them don't know it unless they have to have a reason to have a nasal culture. Now, I know from my own personal experience, I've had a couple of surgeries and they always do a nasal culture and they give you a prescription from Upuricin. And if either Staph aureus or MRSA grows out, then they tell you to fill a prescription and use it for several days and so forth. An interesting point, there was information in the literature that showed Staph aureus or MRSA kills off coag negative staph. So there's about
Okay, say that again.
Staph Staph aureus and MRSA produce some type of toxins that kill off and prevent coag negative staph or mark-ons from growing.
That's interesting. That is really interesting. Okay. So
Now,
the staph that causes mark-ons can be killed off by the Staph aureus, which is another bacteria, right?
yeah.
That's
Now,
really interesting.
here's another interesting part of that point.
Oh, yeah, but that's intriguing. But go ahead.
Many doctors who have diagnosed the patient with SIRS and they get a report back that shows Staph aureus, they won't treat the Staph aureus because if they do, the possibility of the patient contracting mark-ons becomes very high.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, I believe they would treat the patient if they had MRSA because of the consequences of MRSA.
Sure.
But just Staph aureus, they let them stay with the Staph aureus because it protects them from the mark-ons.
Yeah,
And
interesting.
all the negative things that mark-ons causes.
Sure.
Okay.
Now, where does the biofilm? Let's talk about the biofilm. Where does it come into interplay here?
Okay. Just a little quick comment. Back in around 2015, I was talking with Dr. Shoemaker, and he said to me, "You should develop a biofilm assay for mark-ons." So it took me about 3 or 4 months, and I developed a biofilm assay.
Okay,
Now,
well, let's just stop for a minute. Let's tell our listening audience what a biofilm is. Okay.
Okay. In this case, it's a bacterial community of bacterial cells, and these bacterial cells.
Now, it could be more than bacteria, though. It could be bacteria, funguses, yeast,
Any of these
parasites. I mean, it
Yeah.
could be a whole different kind of microorganisms, right?
Yeah. Yeast,
Okay.
mold.
All living in under one roof.
So in this case, we're just looking at mark-ons, which is a gram-positive bacteria. And these bacteria produce this polymeric matrix. Back in the early literature in the 80s, the studies would call it slime because it's a sticky consistency, all right? And they produce this, and then they develop into communities. And I've observed this under the microscope. Really interesting.
So this let's summarize this, okay?
Yep.
So the bacteria, the staph bacteria, produces this slime, which is
Yep.
the biofilm,
Which
is the
biofilm.
And inside that slime is a whole bunch of host of different microorganisms, and that's kind of like it's like a roof over their head to protect them from the outside, correct?
Exactly. And what it does is it prevents the immune system from successfully attacking the bacteria or whatever the other organisms might be.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
it prevents antibiotics from penetrating through that sticky material where they're all clumped together.
Mm-hmm,
Now,
mm-hmm.
I did some experiments with this where I took mark-ons and I took a certain amount of bacteria and I grew it in a nutrient broth at 37 degrees overnight, took it out, mixed it. It was all cloudy because the bacteria grew. And I took a drop, put it on a microscope, did a wet mount. And what I saw in the field were these clumps like this. I mean, it was really, really very interesting to actually see it in the flesh, so to speak. So they stick together in big groups.
Like communities.
Like communities, exactly right. And what makes them important is you have to know how to break through the biofilm to kill the bacteria.
Okay, so Doctor, I'm sorry, but I've got to get my computer cord. I'm going to run out of juice if I don't. So sing a song or tell a poem. I'll be right back. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe just maybe somehow summarize again what a biofilm is in a real, easy, understandable fashion for our listening audience. I'll be right back.
Well, think about, everybody knows what an M&M is, okay? Think of holding an M&M in your between your fingers, and it has this hard coating, and then inside is the chocolate. Well, think of the bacteria as the chocolate, and that shell that's covering it is this sticky slime that brings them all together, and it prevents the antibiotics to penetrate through, and it prevents the immune system, the immune cells, when they attack it, they get stuck, and they can't actively kill these bacteria. So in order to kill them, it's important to have something that can break through the biofilm and then kill the bacteria. And
Well, this is really very, very informative for our listening audience, Dr. Musto. You're doing a wonderful job, by the way. And I'm actually intrigued myself by this, even though I've studied this stuff. You're doing a wonderful job, by the way. So continue on.
All right. Now, to get back to Dr. Shoemaker for just a moment. In his protocol, he has 12 steps for treatment. And many of these patients going through these 12 steps, it may take a year, it may take longer than that. They're literally cured of this biotoxin illness. Okay. Now, Marcon's is part of his protocol. And of the 12 steps, it's step 3. The first step is the patient has to get out of that moldy environment because they're continuing to breathe in all these toxins that makes them sick.
What percent of people, Dr. Musto, are living in a moldy toxin environment like that? What percentage of people would you estimate, or have studies been shown, what percentage of people are living in that kind of environment or have been exposed to it?
Yeah, the statistics, I think the government statistics actually show that more than 50% of every building in the United States has water damage, which means they have mold and bacterial growth. Now, for the person that doesn't have the genetic defect, they're breathing these toxins in, but their immune system is producing antibodies that are going to bind to these toxins so they can excrete them. So they may have symptoms that are related to asthma, for example, or allergies. And then once they get out of that environment, they don't have the symptoms anymore. So
because their immune system is capable of getting rid of those toxins that are caused from those microorganisms, those molds and things of that nature. Their system is capable, but the people who have the genetic weakness, they can't get rid of them, so they develop these chronic symptoms.
Absolutely, and those symptoms can last for years until they find the right doctor, basically. Okay.
Yes, so. And that's where functional medicine really shines, because we in functional medicine dive deep into things like this and look beyond the norm to find out things that are in the research, but the average family doctor is not studying or exposed to, right?
Yeah. Let me make another comment about coag negative staph. So I have a laboratory report. It'll say organism 1, excuse me, organism 1, staph coag negative, large amount. And underneath it will say Marcon's. And then when you look at the susceptibility, you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 resistant drugs. In order for it to be categorized as Marcon's, there has to be at least 2 resistant drugs, or one resistant drug and an intermediate resistant. Okay. And that's the definition of MARCONs. Now, when a patient takes this report to their primary care doctor, and he or she sees at the top line, staph coag negative, you know what the response is? Oh, that's normal flora.
Interesting.
That's normal because,
oh my goodness gracious,
staph coag negative is like staph epidermidis. We have it on our skin. If I were to take my fingers right now and just put them on an agar plate that grows bacteria, and I just touch the plate with my fingers, put it in the incubator at 37 degrees, tomorrow morning I'll have all these little white spots all over the place. That's the bacteria. So the doctors know, oh, staph coag negative, that's normal flora, because they have no idea that it produces toxins and the effect it has on hormones and on and on and on.
Well, like why is it considered normal flora for the nasal passages when you're saying it triggers these symptoms, and then it's in the medical literature? It seems to be contradictory.
Well, let me just go back. Excuse me. We see about 10 or 12% of the staph coag negative that we grow from patients' cultures have one antibiotic resistant. That's normal flora in the nose. And in conversations with Dr. Shoemaker, he says, if it's one antibiotic resistant, it's normal flora and it doesn't need to be treated because it's not going to produce.
Okay. Now I see what you're saying. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. But I've heard that story where the patient will call for whatever reason and tell me that exactly what the doctor said. Oh, that's normal flora.
Okay, so if it's marked 2 or more antibiotic resistance, then it becomes pathogenic.
Yes, exactly.
And especially in the person who's got the genetic weakness already, it becomes really, really very pathogenic for them.
Completely correct. Yes.
Okay, that's good. This is really, really good. This is really intriguing because, again, a lot of doctors are seeing it and they don't understand the significance of the 2 or more antibiotic resistant strains that are living in that person.
Let me tell you a little story, a personal story, just thumbnail sketch. I go for a physical every year, and I have this primary care doc who I've known for probably 15 years. And last year I said to him, I'd like to talk to you about biotoxin illness. So I told him a little bit about it. He said, I'm really not interested. And you know why he said that? He says,
I have no idea.
My colleagues at Mass General Hospital don't believe in it.
It's a religion. It's a religion. That's unfortunate. It's a religion.
We're supposed to be the medical mecca here in the Boston area. Okay.
Now, this stuff is in the medical literature, right? We're talking about this. It's all documented in the medical literature. So we're not talking about some off the wall theory. This is in the medical literature.
It's evidence-based.
Yes.
Evidence-based.
Yeah. Now, again, I want to just regress just for a minute. I will come back to two things I need to do. I need to just take a quick break to let people know they're listening to The Other Side of Medicine. Folks, this program, I have been broadcasting The Other Side of Medicine for 30 years, and I have been the watchdog for people across the country to help to prevent you from being over-medicated, having unnecessary surgeries, from being scammed by natural cures that are not evidence-based. If you or your family member or your loved ones are interested in becoming independently healthy, then this is where you want to be every Thursday evening, because we have guest experts like Dr. Musto here, who is brilliant, who has an expertise in this specific field, and who is the medical director for a laboratory that looks at and diagnosing conditions like Marcon's and other conditions that other physicians are not looking at. So you need to tell your family and friends about the other side of medicine, because we want you to be independently healthy. So let's get back. We're talking with Dr. Musto, who is talking right now about a condition called chronic inflammatory syndrome, and Marcon's condition, which is bacteria that harbors inside of the sinus, and it's a staph bacteria that's antibiotic resistant, and there is about 22% of the population who have a genetic predisposition to not being able to clear out the toxins from that bacteria, and they get many different symptoms, over 37 different symptoms, including chronic fatigue, brain fog. It could lead to things like even Alzheimer's, strokes, and a whole lot more. So, Dr. Musto, please continue.
All right, let me talk a little bit about CIRS, SIRS. Dr. Shoemaker
Chronic inflammatory syndrome. Go ahead.
Response syndrome. He has compiled statistically these 37 symptoms. I think this is really very, very important and interesting. He's compiled these 37 symptoms statistically into 13 clusters, categories. If a person has one symptom in each of 8 of these 13 categories, the possibility of biotoxin illness from mold and bacteria is 92%. That's the probability. Now, there's a very basic, inexpensive test that the mold doctors will do on the patient in their office, or they could have the patient do it on the computer. It's $15 for the test. It's called a visual contrast sensitivity test.
And by the way, just for our listening audience, we're going to have that test available through my practice, and you'll be able to get that test, just to let you know. Go ahead.
Okay. So if the patient has one symptom in each of 8 categories of the 13, and they fail the visual contrast sensitivity test, the possibility of them having biotoxin illness is 98.5%.
Wow.
And there's only 2 expenses that the patient incurred. One is the doctor visit, and the other is the $15 for the visual contrast sensitivity test.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the starting point. Plus, a complete physical examination, and there's certain characteristics of these patients who have the circulating toxins, these physical characteristics that the physicians know that make up part of the diagnosis. Once this has been established, then there's a whole series of blood markers, and there's a genetic test, a genetic blood test based on HLA haplotypes, and that will show the defect that the patient has in their immune system. So it's probably, his protocol is probably the most scientific and the most comprehensive of any protocol that mold expert doctors are using and not following his protocol. There's a lot of experts, people who call themselves mold doctors, and they write books. Most of them don't test for Marcon's. And the patients, if it's diagnosed correctly, the Marcon's are going to prevent the patient from ever becoming completely better. Basically, that's what That's what the physicians who treat these patients tell me. And it's really very interesting, and it's very sad that people are spending a lot of money with doctors who don't have good protocols for diagnosing and treating mold illness.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, oftentimes they'll tell people that a lot of these symptoms are just in their head, right? And it's not. It's in their body's physiology and chemistry that has been disrupted by these
Yeah.
toxins, and of course the effect of marcons complicating the whole situation. So this has been very, very intriguing, and we really appreciate you being on this podcast, Dr. Musto. And I tell you, you've been really very, very gracious to come on in the evening like this after being in your workplace all day in the lab. And your lab has been in existence now for how long?
This lab I established in February 2015.
Okay. You've been working in laboratories for over 50 years.
Oh, yeah. I actually started doing work for Dr. Shoemaker in a previous lab. I had a full service laboratory, a lab that did chemistry, hematology, microbiology, toxicology, and so forth. In 2011 is when I first contacted Dr. Shoemaker. He was looking for a lab that would do this special culture for him. And I spoke with him for about a half an hour on the phone. And at the end of the conversation, he said, well, I'm going to have you be the laboratory, and I'm going to put you on my website called Surviving Mold, and recommend that all of the clinicians using my protocol send these marcons to your laboratory. So that's how it all started back in 2011. I sold that lab, but kept all the clinicians that were sending us samples and established just a microbiology lab.
Wonderful. Well, this has been certainly a wonderful experience to be able to have to get your expertise in this field and to hear about this condition called chronic inflammatory syndrome and the marcons has been very interesting. And so I'd like to thank you for being a guest on our podcast. Is there anything that you would like to share about what we talked about this evening before you leave?
I would say, getting back to the comment that you made about people, the doctors think it's in their head. I can't tell you how many hundreds of patients I've spoken to. Now, they'll call up and I'll do an interpretation of the test. I'll explain what the marcons are and things like this, okay? And they will tell me their medical history. Now, I don't need to know their medical history, but I listen to them, okay? These are the people that I described earlier who have been having these symptoms for a year, 2, 3 years. They've been to 10 different doctors, and they tell me they'll have a complete blood workup, CBC, chemistry panel, thyroid tests, some other tests, inflammatory, like SED rates and so forth. And they'll go back 2 weeks later, and the doctor will say, everything is normal. I suggest you see a psychiatrist. The doctor's telling the patient, you're crazy, there's nothing wrong with you. And the patient is sick as can be.
It's sad.
It's very frustrating.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate.
Do I have another minute to just talk about some treatments?
Oh, please do. Please.
All right. We run these 15 antibiotics, but the antibiotics are not generally used to treat the patient. Like a physician would treat a patient who has a urinary tract infection based on the antibiotic susceptibilities. We only run the susceptibilities to see if there's multiple resistances to qualify it as marcons. There's about 6 or 8 different nasal sprays. The one that was first developed about 20 years ago is called BEG, B-E-G spray. It's Bactroban, EDTA, and gentamicin in a very low concentration, where the patient will, it comes in a nasal spray bottle, about 60 mLs. They'll do 2 sprays each nostril for about 5 or 6 weeks, and then be retested. My involvement, as I mentioned earlier, with ionic silver, it developed into a product, compounded product, with 50 parts per million of colloidal silver and 0.5% EDTA. Now, I mentioned earlier, silver kills everything. In fact, people were using silver sprays during the COVID period, because it was also effective against COVID. It's effective against a lot of different viruses. It's relatively safe. I did some calculations based on toxicity level, and it turns out that a 6-week regimen of 2 sprays each nostril 3 times a day of 50 parts per million will generate 2.5 milligrams of ionic silver. And then the half-life is about 15 days. So in a 70-kilogram man or woman, the toxicity is 3,500 milligrams. So if you are doing a 6-week cycle, you can see that you can do that for a long time. Figure that 1 year is about 8 6-week cycles. Is that right? Yeah, 52 weeks. Okay, 48 weeks, 52 weeks. So you can do this for years and not get into the toxic level. People think, oh, silver, it's going to make me turn gray or blue. That's silver. It's not the ionic silver.
Yes.
Then there are other sprays that use a witch hazel base with EDTA. There's another product that was developed by a physician herbalist in New Jersey, and she contracted with compounding pharmacy to provide that. And that's a pure herbal. She has an herbal farm, and she put together a very nice product, and I did some evaluation on that. Then
how effective is that?
Excuse me?
How effective is that herbal spray?
In vitro, it did kill the mark-ons. It was limited, whereas the silver is a broad spectrum antimicrobial. This pretty much was limited to just the mark-ons. And
I see.
it would be administered for about 3 months, and it was effective.
Okay. That's really good to know.
There's another product that uses grapefruit seed extract with EDTA, 0.5% of each component, and that's very effective. And I did some studies on some products, over-the-counter products, and on this compounded product as well. And the grapefruit seed extract kills gram-positive, gram-negative mold and yeast. Now, these prescriptions made by compounding pharmacy are somewhere between $110, $150, something around there. There's a couple of products that can be purchased on the internet. One of them is actually available in some of the big pharmacies. There's a product called Xlear, X-L-E-A-R. It's grapefruit seed extract. And
I'm familiar with that.
Excuse me?
I'm familiar with that product.
Oh, okay. That's 0.2% grapefruit seed extract with xylitol. And I did some experiments on that 3 or 4 years ago, and that was very effective. Now, a product like that is $10 or $15 compared to $100+ for a prescription. And then this company I mentioned to you before, Results RNA, they make a product, a nasal spray. It's colloidal ionic silver, 50 parts per million. It comes with 6 herbs that are supposed to be soothing to the mucous membranes. They offer it as 3 1-ounce bottles, that's 90 mLs, for $30. Now, it takes about 55 mLs to do a 6-week cycle of any of these products, any of these nasal sprays. 2 sprays each nostril 3 times a day for 6 weeks. Comes out to about 55 mLs. So getting 90 mLs for $30, if you have to do double treatment, and then there's a protocol that uses a maintenance dose after you've eradicated the marcons. The maintenance dose prevents the marcons from coming back. So there's more than enough to do that.
And what is the maintenance dose?
The maintenance dose, let's take the silver, for example, where 2 sprays each nostril 3 times a day. After the marcons are eradicated, the maintenance dose would be 1 spray each nostril twice a day. And this comes into play in the chronic inflammatory response syndrome protocol. As the patient goes through and is treated at these 12 different steps to normalize all of the abnormalities that have developed, they get to step 12, which is a treatment called vasoactive intestinal peptide, VIP, and it's a nasal spray. And it's important that the patient does not have marcons, because those toxins that it produces that break down the MSH, they also break down the VIP. VIP is expensive. So if the patient is taking that, see a resolution of their symptoms, the marcons are making it inactive, basically. And it costs a lot of money for that. I should mention one other thing about the silver. Because it's ionic silver, it's very reactive. Saline reacts with this and produces silver chloride, which is inactive. So I tell patients, as well as the clinicians, if the patient is going to use any product with saline in it, they should read the label. Like this Xlear is made up in saline. Some people like to use Xlear and silver. And I say, you can do that, but just make sure you separate them by 3 hours.
Okay, very good.
So you don't inactivate the silver.
Sure.
And many clinicians are not aware of that.
Well, that's certainly good. Just one point before we go, because we run out of time here.
Okay.
I want to go back to that last step that you talked about. That I'm not personally clear on what you said on the last step, that if we don't do it correctly, it'll be too expensive. Explain that one more time, please.
Okay. If the person has marcons.
Yeah. And they didn't get rid of it.
They didn't get rid of it, or it came back, and they're put on the VIP nasal spray. VIP is a 28 amino acid peptide. Okay. And it's a nasal spray.
And it's expensive.
It's very expensive, hundreds of dollars per month. The marcon toxins not only break down the MSH, they break down the VIP. So in the Dr. Shoemaker's protocol, he specifically says you have to eradicate the marcons. Don't start the VIP, because you're not going to get any benefit from it.
Got it. Okay, perfect.
Clear?
Okay, perfect. Dr. Musto, you have been wonderful. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you sometime in the future to come back, and we'll find something else for you to talk about. I'm sure you've got a lot more things to talk about in your years of experience. So thank you so much. And our listening audience, we are very privileged to have this gentleman on tonight. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And remember, the other side of medicine is your watchdog for all things natural, keep you healthy and to protect you from all the things that could be a danger to your health. We're all natural, evidence-based natural medicine here. Everything we do is based on 3 principles, my friends. Common sense, backed up by good science, and always in cooperation with nature. Until next time, I'm Dr. Krystosik, and follow us on social media, Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on all the social media, including YouTube. Until next time, my friends, may God bless you, and here's to your health.
Thank you very much for inviting me.